London, 1798. Terrorist novel writing. Take an old castle, half of it ruinous, a long gallery with a great many doors, some secret ones, 3 murdered bodies, quite fresh, as many skeletons in chests and presses, an old woman hanging by the neck with her throat cut, assassins and desperadoes, quantity sufficient, noise, whispers, and groans 70 at least. Mix them together in the form of 3 volumes to be taken at any of the watering places before going to bed.
In 1764, the Castle of Otranto rose up on the literary landscape. This thin little book of some 115 pages was written by the son of the most powerful Prime Minister of the 18th century. Horace Walpole had 2 castles in his life. The first was his country home, Strawberry Hill. The second, the Castle of Otranto, was inspired by that real place and was the earliest and most influential of the Gothic fictions. Set in Italy at the time of the Crusades, the story concerns one Manfred, the tyrant of Otranto, who has obtained the castle by foul means, and whose subsequent efforts to keep it include poisoning and imprisoning, forcing marriage on one young girl, and stabbing another. There is a giant statue, a flight into an underground vault, a moving portrait, a dark forest, long corridors, ghosts, caverns, monks, and outraged innocence. As Philippa Gregory describes, the whole gamut, which went into later Gothic paraphernalia, appears in this first version.
First of all, you have to think exotic. So your classic Gothic novel is something which is generally set abroad in a sense of other landscape, wilder landscape, dangerous landscape, forests, banditti, corsairs, maybe a dragon or 2. It certainly has a supernatural element, so you always have ghosts and spooky visitations. Generally has a heroine who has trouble rising to these challenges, I may say, has a lot of incipient sadism towards the heroine, who is the one who has to suffer throughout the course of this, and generally has a thoroughly bad person, generally the villain, who, interestingly enough, tends often to be the most interesting character.
The first thing that struck Manfred's eyes was a group of his servants endeavouring to raise something that appeared to him a mountain of sable plumes. He gazed without believing his sight. "What are ye doing?" cried Manfred wrathfully. "Where is my son?" A volley of voices replied, "Oh, my lord, the prince, the helmet, the helmet." Shocked with these lamentable sounds, and dreading he knew not what, he advanced hastily. But what a sight for a father's eyes! He beheld his child dashed to pieces and almost buried under an enormous helmet, 100 times more large than any cask ever made for human being, and shaded with a proportionable quantity of black feathers.
For David Punter of the International Gothic Association, the Castle of Otranto became itself a phenomenon.
It had a tremendous impact. One could say that it offended against all the kinds of norms and expectations of the middle 18th century. The preceding decades had seen 2 cultural features: the dominance of rationalism, the dominance of the rule of reason, and the consequent exiling of the passions and emotions. And it had also seen the rise of the novel, with writers like Richardson and Fielding. And when we talk of the rise of the novel, we mean very much, I think, the rise of the realist novel. And, of course, if there's one thing that Castle of Otranto was not, it is realist.
We're in the grounds now looking across at Horace Walpole's house, and it's certainly not an ordinary house. It's partly very grand, partly a stately home, but partly a castle. I'm not sure what it is.
I think for Walpole it was more than anything in the world, it was his fantasy. He called it my little plaything castle.
Stephen Calloway, art historian and expert on Walpolenalia, which, in the middle of the 18th century, raised medieval turrets and arches and mock battlements in the unlikely setting of fashionable riverside Twickenham. Not only did Horace Walpole write the first Gothic novel, but he was the first of the Gothic trendsetters whose influence led eventually, and perhaps still more bizarrely, to the grandiose and authoritative Gothic of the Houses of Parliament.
It's really one of the key buildings of the Gothic revival, and it's not the only Gothic house, and even in Walpole's time it wasn't anywhere near the first Gothic house. It's just incomparably the most famous.
There's a lot of stuff, a lot of windows with a lot of different shapes, a lot of chimneys, each one decorated completely differently. Is that muchness distinctively Gothic?
It's the variety. Horace said that he didn't really want to have anything symmetrical. He loved the idea of what he called sharawagi, which is the Chinese taste for sort of want of symmetry. It's a kick in the teeth to the whole idea of Palladian grandeur, if you like. And we have to always remember, he is the Prime Minister's son, but he's the youngest son, and he's the youngest son who doesn't feel that he's part of the sort of family of Norfolk squires. And he quite early on recognised that he was different. He was aesthetic. He was, as he saw it, lean and thin, and the squires were fat. And he talks about going up to the family house and not knowing whether to carve a slice of beef or carve a slice off one of the cheeks of his Norfolk squire brothers. And the Gothic revival is, to a great extent, a style about fun, but about opposition to prevailing taste of the day.
Strawberry Hill now lies incongruously in London's suburbia. Led by the house guide, Anna Chalcraft, we left the 20th century traffic behind and prepared for Gothic gloom. I see now what you mean about the cloister being seen from the front door, and to have that tiny door right at the other end creates a sense of perspective. It makes it look much bigger than it really is.
That's right, and I think that was one of the things that he concentrated on with most of the building of the house, trying to make it appear that everything is larger or more unexpected. It has to always take you unawares.
I'm hoping that our candle isn't going to go out. As we look up through the stairwell, there's a big space and sense of distance, even though it's all on this miniaturized scale.
At the top of the staircase is his bedroom, and it was from his bedroom that he had a dream of a gigantic arm, clad in armour, appearing at the top of the banister, the utmost area of the banister. Absolutely enormous arm, and around this he designed the Castle of Otranto.
Diego had no sooner opened the door than he cried out and ran back. I ran back too and said, "Is it the ghost?" "The ghost? No, no," said Diego, and his hair stood on end. "It is a giant, I believe. He is all clad in armour, for I saw his foot and part of his leg, and they are as large as the helmet below in the court." As he said these words, my lord, we heard a violent motion, and the rattling of armour, as if the giant was rising. "Good my lord, send for the chaplain and have the castle exorcised, for certain it is enchanted."
It was a very popular book, and people were fascinated to see where literary people live. And when they drove up to Strawberry Hill, which was surrounded by fields, and saw the Gothic crockets of Strawberry Hill, they must have known they were in the right place.
Clive Wainwright of the Victoria and Albert Museum explains how the success of Walpole's novel made his house still more of an attraction. You read the bestseller, and that made you want to see the best sellers, the gloomiest cloisters, the most secretive of libraries, the spookiest of towers. The book, the house, and the self-conscious drama of Walpole's vision provided his visitors with the complete Gothic experience.
Interestingly, it's the best documented 18th century house that we have because of Walpole's efforts. He then wrote his own guidebook, which is packed with information. So he did his very, very best to publicise the house, and with it, the Gothic style.
He had really established himself at Strawberry Hill and started on this Gothic extravaganza by the time he wrote The Castle of Otranto. How far did the house relate to the book?
Well, it's difficult to know whether to believe Walpole or not. He writes about writing The Castle of Otranto and actually writing it in a fevered state, walking around the house and writing it day and night. Certainly, walking around Strawberry Hill by candlelight with the moon shining through the stained glass windows and onto the medieval armour standing in the hall must have put one in a very Gothic mood.
For a minute space, this really does feel like a passage. And into a much bigger space.
This was the new library. He was very, very excited about building this room. It's certainly, I think, one of the most exciting rooms ever built. It's really, even in its time, one of the most famous rooms in England.
In spite of the big window letting in lots of light, it's actually quite dark in here.
He loved his Gothic gloomth, as he called it, and that was always part of the theatre of the house.
It is a library, so of course there are bookshelves, but being Walpole, these bookshelves are all highly decorated arches with lots of little curls and wavy pieces on them. How do you put books on a Gothic bookshelf?
Well, if you have Gothic bookcases, there's a real difficulty about how do you get the books into them, or can you get only big books in the middle and little books at the edges? And of course they solved this rather beautifully. And if I go over to the bookcase here, you'll see that I'm just going to swing out a whole Gothic arcade, and as it comes out I hope it creaks in a Gothic way. And you can see it gives you access to all the bookcases. This whole hinged piece there just slips neatly back into position,
so that the sense of the book coming out of the experience of his Gothic imagination is here too.
I don't think there's any way you can separate the book and the building and Horace himself. I think he saw everything about his life here, about his building, his writing, as one absolutely, completely knit together operation.
As Walpole blended fiction into fact with the making of Strawberry Hill, so in his novel, the idea of the castle is the true focus. And that castle, though it was the incarnation of the Gothic, represented so much more than just an elaborate pastiche. As a Whig and a long-standing Member of Parliament, Horace Walpole's political commitments were at the root of his interest in the medieval. Many of his contemporaries were busy erecting Gothic shrines and follies in their landscaped grounds. Like them, Walpole's enthusiasm for his own property was connected to a belief in what Marilyn Butler describes as the conservatism of the Anglo-Saxon inheritance.
In some really important way, I think that the castle, particularly the big house or the castle, was a sort of current image for the sort of nation, the place, the community. And that really came out in a book of the 1760s, the same year as the Castle of Otranto, is the year of Blackstone's Commentaries. This is a great work of political theory. And it's rather conservative, and it makes the point that, you know, the superiority of Britain and the British Constitution is that it's like a great house that was built in time past. And the house was so great that it was all irregular and almost unknowable. And so he produces the entire definition, really, of the country as a great house, to which things have been added. And you can't pull away from it without damage. You know, something more might fall down.
If one thinks about the titles of so many of the novels that have now become famous to us as classic Gothic novels, over and over again the castle, the place, the house are emphasised. Why is that idea of the architecture so significant in the Gothic?
I think the house is a device to introduce Gothic and supernatural elements. So because it's an old place, it is therefore expected to be haunted. It's also a period of time in the 18th century when people are getting increasingly interested and concerned about inheritance and how land is transferred and how land can be claimed. They're talking about it a period of enclosures. So the whole notion of how do you get and keep a house in your family is quite important. It was actually important to Walpole himself. And also the idea of lineage then matters as well. And I think in a society which is in danger, as they would say, to becoming more democratic, the notion of nobility and a noble seat matters very much as well. It's often set in relationship to Roman Catholicism, which we're now in the 18th century far enough away from the Protestant Revolution to find Catholicism gives us a bit of a frisson rather than is a real danger that Catholicism might return as a major dominant religion in Britain. So we find Catholicism and the notion of monasteries and abbeys and nuns and clerical misdoings as well rather exciting.
Gothic tales, horror stories and melodramatic fictions, from Edgar Allan Poe's House of Usher to Hitchcock's Psycho, have all inherited from Walpole an obsession with setting, the place where terrifying things may have happened, the room which may or may not be safe. For a contemporary writer of Gothic like Patrick McGrath, Walpole anticipates Freud, and the house the castle, physically realised, becomes an image of the mind.
There's something supernatural, or what he calls preternatural, on practically every page of the Castle of Otranto. And the idea of a house that is very complex in its internal architecture, a house that may be crumbling, a house that carries secrets, dangers, hidden horrors and hidden terrors. I think what we're reading through this is the picture of a Gothic psyche, and the sorts of figures that people Gothic novels do tend to have psyches that reflect or are reflected in the houses that they live in. So what we're getting is this echo of the real matter of the Gothic, which is psychological disturbance, disorder, complexity, and probably reflecting a new idea of what the human mind is in the later 18th century.
With the writers of Gothic fiction, I think there's a sense that somehow the supernatural serves an emotional need, and that things do seem uncanny, and you can't explain everything away.
Terry Castle, remaining true to her Gothic name, sees that not all dark places can be filled with light. It may be that the late 18th century witnessed a rise in rationalism and the apparently objective investigations of science. But despite that, or perhaps because of it, it was also a time when the ghost story was a hugely popular form, and it looked back to a past where troubling shapes still lurked in the background.
I think one of the great themes of the Gothic is that the past always returns to haunt you, whether in the form of an actual ghost or through something like a familial curse, as in the Castle of Otranto. The parental generation and their sins or transgressions seem to be visited on the children, the younger generation in Gothic fiction. And that dynamic suggests to me a sense of the power of the past to shape the present, often in horrifying ways.
Long before the familiar coffin and burial stories, whether Bram Stoker's Dracula or Stephen King's Salem's Lot, Walpole and his Gothic successors, like Anne Radcliffe, were facing up to the living dead and looking down into the abyss.
The lower part of the castle was hollowed into several intricate cloisters, and it was not easy for one under so much anxiety to find the door that opened into the cavern. An awful silence reigned throughout those subterraneous regions, except now and then some blasts of wind that shook the doors she had passed, and which, grating on the rusty hinges, were re-echoed through that long labyrinth of darkness. Every murmur struck her with new terror.
Out of this closed-in space, and yes, into the gallery, which is gold and dazzlingly and big for a change.
It's an enormous gallery, isn't it? It's 56 feet long, 13 wide and 17 high. Quite splendid. It's all made of papier-mâché. And the only gallery, I believe, of the 18th century where the window walls are on the opposite side to the mirror. And this, I think, is so that at night, when candles are lit, then family portraits hanging between the windows would have been reflected in the mirrored wall, and with the candles they would have flickered and seemed alive.
It feels as though there'd be more and more ghosts here as people come off the walls and into the mirrors.
Well, this is the area, of course, in which in Otranto the figure in white came from the panel, stepped out of the panel and chased Manfred down the long gallery to the small closet on the right-hand side.
Pushing open the door gently, he saw a person kneeling before the altar. As he approached nearer, it seemed not a woman, but one in a long woolen weed whose back was towards him. The person seemed absorbed in prayer. The Marquis was about to return, when the figure, rising, stood some moments, fixed in meditation, without regarding him. The Marquis, expecting the holy person to come forth, and meaning to excuse his uncivil interruption, said, "Reverend Father, I sought the Lady Hippolyta." "Hippolyta," replied a hollow voice, "camest thou to this castle to seek Hippolyta?" And then the figure, turning slowly round, discovered to Frederick the fleshless jaws and empty sockets of a skeleton wrapped in a hermit's cowl. "Angels of grace, protect me!" cried Frederick, recoiling. "Deserve their protection," said the spectre.
I think that it was possible at the time to read Gothic novels with what people call delicious terror, and they use the word delicious terror, and what I think is the kind of fun you have on a really scary fairground ride, or the kind of thrill that lots of people get from horror movies. And it is scary, it's undoubtedly scary, but the pleasure you get is, the increased heart rate and the sense of, whoa! And I think that that is play. It's quite scary play, but I think it's definitely play.
A beautiful purple room, and here in front of us, the most sumptuous fireplace, huge and elongated, big sweeping lines right up to the ceiling. What is this?
Well, it was one of the principal showpieces of the house, and in the same room he had a very sumptuous bed, and beside the bed hung Cardinal Wolsey's hat. And, of course, it was one of the things that visitors loved to touch as they went round. And it epitomises the whole essence of Walpole, which is that you never quite know what you're looking at. Are you looking at real things or fictional things or fantasies? Some things are real, like the hat. Others are not quite real, they're copies, like the drawings. Or like the furniture, they're real chairs, but they're not actually of the real period. All the time, he's playing with you. You're being shown things and you're invited to be sucked into the imaginative dream, if you like. It's a bit like a theme park in a curious way, because it's all about the experience. It's actually not quite about authenticity in any way. And I think that's very Horace.
I think it's all a game for Horace. It seems to me that Strawberry Hill can be conceived as a great closet, so that most people in society couldn't see the real man he was.
Aha! So that's what it's all about. Timothy Mole is Horace Walpole's latest biographer.
I'm convinced that men of an effeminate nature are drawn to the sinuosity of Gothic, the wonderful sinuosity of ogee curves, crocketed pinnacles, quatrefoils and cinquefoils. And the Gothic architecture of Strawberry Hill seems to reflect this interest in feminine, sinuous, curvaceous forms. Something slightly kitsch, slightly camp, naughty, alternative, feminine, perfect for a gay bachelor.
The term camp does come to mind with Walpole, certainly when we think of sort of the details of his life and what we know about his own sexuality, which seems to have been homoerotically identified in some ways. Certain sort of melodramatic exchanges between characters epitomize for us a sort of ludicrous theatricality. It's hard to imagine Walpole writing some of these scenes with a straight face, given what we know about him from his letters. I mean, he is one of the great letter writers in European literature, and they're very funny, very cosmopolitan, very sophisticated.
So Walpole's extravagance of style, his seriously frivolous play with the surfaces which conceal depths, is not just the precursor for crude Victorian melodrama and the Hammer House of Horror, but it might look forward to the elaborate posing of Oscar Wilde in The Picture of Dorian Gray, or the subtle codes of Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which know very well that any self-creation is not natural, but artificial. The surrealism in the Castle of Otranto was, for John Sutherland, the beginning of an invigorating style in English literature.
Walpole does things which are, frankly, off the wall. The novel has a very famous opening. It opens on the day of the wedding of Conrad, the only son of the ruler of Otranto, to Isabella of Vicenza. And this ceremony is interrupted by a huge helmet which flies from the statue of Alonso, the former Prince of Otranto, which kills Conrad. Now, this, you'd think, even in the 16th century, is somewhat bizarre. We never find out, incidentally, what makes this helmet fly around killing people. But then Manfred, the father's response, is quite bizarre. He actually turns to Isabella, who's just lost her prospective husband, at the altar, and says, in short, He says, I cannot offer you my son, I offer you myself. He says, I'll marry you too, because I've lost my son, I need other sons. Now that kind of thing, which is done in a very straight-faced, deadpan way, is delicious.
A clap of thunder at that instant shook the castle to its foundations. The earth rocked, and the clank of more than mortal armor was heard behind. Frederick and Jerome thought the last day was at hand. The latter, forcing Theodore along with them, rushed into the court. The moment Theodore appeared, the walls of the castle behind Manfred were thrown down with a mighty force, and the form of Alfonso, dilated to an immense magnitude, appeared in the centre of the ruins. "Behold in Theodore, the true heir of Alfonso," said the vision. And having pronounced those words, accompanied by a clap of thunder, it ascended solemnly towards heaven, where the clouds parting asunder, the form of Saint Nicholas was seen, and receiving Alfonso's shade, they were soon wrapped from mortal eyes in a blaze of glory.
As Walpole grew older, Gothic fiction grew up. It swelled to giant size in the 1790s, when Anne Radcliffe took her readers on ever more sensational adventures. But lesser writers copied her success with cheaper thrills, and Gothic fiction lost its cachet as castles of Wolfenbach and old manor houses filled the shelves of the circulating libraries. Eventually, it was Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey, a parody of the Gothic castle, where the banal replaced the terrific, which both celebrated the heyday of the early Gothic and marked the end of its career. In Austen's spoof Gothic Abbey, laundry lists were discovered in the secret chest, and dinner, arriving late on the table, was the worst domestic crime. For John Sutherland, this was a missed opportunity, as suggested by another work of late Gothic fiction, Matthew Lewis's The Monk.
The Monk really is quite incredible. It opens in Madrid with this wonderful preacher. He's got a young assistant called Rosario, who turns out to be a young woman called Matilda, and they have an absolute wild sexual orgy that goes on for days, and then Matilda turns out to be the devil. But you can see what Lewis is doing. He's actually saying anything that can be imagined can be written. Now, where does that go? And it goes straight to Dessart. And Dessart, in fact, was a great admirer of Monk. Now, that's what happens in France. Now, I think that if Gothic had followed its logic, the logic that leads from Walpole to Lewis, and not had this great kind of crushing effect of Jane Austen saying it's all ridiculous, let's talk about young ladies getting married, then I think, you might have had a more interesting 19th century literature. And it is nationally quite different from what happened in France, where, as I say, to some extent they let the Gothic impulse rip.
At the end of the long gallery, we come to a portrait of Walpole, with Strawberry Hill in the background.
He lived a very, very long time. He was 80 when he died. A very august personage. He'd become Earl of Orford.
Sounds as if he became a relic himself.
I think he relished that fact. He loved it. He was, as it were, almost taken up by the smart young things at the end of the 18th century. His great final summation of it says how wonderful it is to totter into vogue.
Horace Walpole never wrote another novel. Instead, he became the most prolific letter writer of the 18th century. Tens of thousands of his letters still exist today. And his view from the Gothic library has shaped history's view of his time. But when he died in 1797, his two plaything castles exerted the most immediate influence. The wealthy aristocrat, William Beckford, wrote an Eastern Gothic tale in Vathek, and he built an enormous rival to Strawberry Hill in his own Fonthill Abbey. Walter Scott echoed Walpole's style in his novels, and he also created a Gothic house at Abbotsford. Horace's own Little Gothic Castle, though haphazardly improvised and built of papier-mâché, still stands, and the Castle of Otranto has never gone out of print.
I think in a way he didn't realize the potential of what he was doing. Otranto is a kind of sketch for a genre, but it would take later writers to draw out the full implications of it. It's as though he dashed this off without, I think, realizing the appetite that he would arouse in readers for the Gothic realm.
That was the Kaleidoscope feature, A Little Gothic Castle. The presenter was Peggy Reynolds, and the programme was produced by Matthew Dodd. The readers were John Shrapnel and Andrew Wincott.
Louis Bronk the Texas scalper. Guilty as sin, all set to die Tuesday. Not a rat's chance in a shark tank for a stay of execution. When he gave the interview to that reporter lady, Molly Cates, he confessed to just about every murder since Cain and Abel. But ask yourself this, is a serial killer going to always tell the truth? Thing is, there's been another murder. Charlie McFarland's second wife, shot, hair shaved clean off, body dumped in the creek. Same as Louis Bronk's other victims. Same as McFarland's first wife. Copycat killer, maybe? Or has old Charlie McFarland got himself something to hide? The Red Scream by Mary Willis Walker. Saturday night at 10:15. American Noir on Radio 4.
This is Radio 4.
And now, On These Days, a look back at some of the events which took place 50 years ago. Your program host for the next hour is Geoffrey Wheeler.
Good evening, and welcome to our review of the main events at home and abroad during the past 7 days. The week beginning Monday, the 24th of February, 1947. It was a week when the Labour government came under intense attack from the opposition, and from some of its own members, for its alleged mismanagement of fuel supplies. As the cold spell continues, parts of Britain experience the lowest temperatures for 30 years. And concern grew for the welfare of Germans living in the British zone of Germany. As a country, we have been used to living on tick. So begins a sobering critique of our current economic woes, published this week by Mr. Kingsley Martin, editor of the New Statesman and Nation magazine. The overseas investments which enabled us to live on foreign labour, Mr. Martin goes on, were largely used up in the war. Our machinery and equipment are out of date, and we have a monstrous job of reconstruction to do. These are the facts about the position of a small island which became a great creditor empire, but which is now resuming a position more natural to a small island. There is no doubt, as Mr. Martin says, that Britain has many hard and painful adjustments to make in this post-war era. But no improvement in our international standing can be expected while the current fuel crisis continues. That crisis was the focus all week for politicians and the public alike. In the House of Commons on Wednesday, Sir Stafford Cripps spoke for more than an hour during the debate on fuel. And the fuel minister, Emmanuel Shinwell, has continued to come under heavy criticism from both the Conservative opposition and some of his own party for his alleged mismanagement of fuel supplies. George Matthews, executive member of the Communist Party, and economic advisor to the Board of Trade, Alec Cairncross.
There was a tendency, by Shinwell particularly, to put the blame on the weather, and undoubtedly the weather was an important factor. But the manpower in the industry had run down so that the numbers engaged in the mining industry were well below the level that was required to produce enough coal for British industry. The whole crisis hung on recruitment. Now, it would have been possible to recruit larger numbers of men in various ways if vigorous action had been taken. They could have recruited from Ireland, for instance, from which many people were brought. They could have recruited citizens of other countries who were stationed in Britain as refugees. Of course, in the Board of Trade, we all felt that Shinwell was much to blame, because here was British industry being starved of coal quite unnecessarily. If only they had exerted themselves to get additional labour and taken steps to economise the use of coal at an earlier stage, we would have got by. It was all a very, very small margin between enough and not enough. An extra 1 million tonnes of coal would have made an enormous difference in February.
The government was in desperate straits at the time. Such was the situation that Arthur Horner, who was a member of the Communist Party and indeed a member of its executive committee, as I was called in to help the government He'd been appointed National Coal Production Officer, nominated by his union, and one night in February 1947, he received a message that Shinwell wanted to see him. They sent a ministry car, and it skidded through the icy streets to the ministry, where Shinwell met him, together with Harold Wilson and Hugh Gateskill. And Shinwell said that the situation as far as London was concerned was extremely serious, that because they weren't getting the coal, there was a problem of producing electricity, that the sewage works depended on electricity, the water supplies were in jeopardy, and in fact the life of the capital could be brought to a standstill. The question was how to get the coal from the north to London, and it had been decided to bring it down by ship. The question was to get it up the Thames. Could Horner use his influence to get the lightermen and the tugmen to ensure that they cooperated in getting the coal to the power stations down the Thames? He agreed to do it, and he had a meeting, he said, with the executive of the Lightermen's Union. They agreed they could do it, and they did.
Britain's economic problems are attracting the attentions of countries around the world.